This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Daniel O'Brien, K-State grain economist, kicks off today's show with his grain market update, where he chats about upcoming grain stocks and acreage reports and the impact they may have. K-State Extension entomologist Anthony Zukoff continues the show as he discusses brown wheat mites and what issues they are causing for growers. Wrapping up the show is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond as he comments on the recent summer-like weather and if there's spring weather in the forecast. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with the grain market update from K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
Daniel, before we talk about the futures and cash market, wanting to touch on reports that are coming out on Tuesday, March 31st, and do these reports have the ability to move the market a bit?
Yes, certainly, particularly the acreage report. Actually, it's called the Prospective Plantings Report, based on surveys carried out by the USDA around March 1st. So that's what the numbers represent, those expectations. There have been a number of factors that have been at play. I sure have heard, and I'm sure our listeners have heard about discussions and about how potentially higher fertilizer prices could affect planted acreage for corn, for other crops around the world. In fact, I've heard that discussion, I read of that discussion with regard to Ukrainian crop prospects and that higher fertilizer prices moving them more so towards oilseeds away from feed coarse grains, and they include wheat in that discussion. So they already have problems through currency issues and logistics getting fertilizer into their country. So here, if fertilizer prices go that much higher, you'd have all this going. But along with the acreage figures, you do have a quarterly stocks report numbers. We'll talk the acreage numbers first, but there's something to watch for in the quarterly stocks as well, I think. So for acreage, pre-report estimates for U.S. corn are 94.371 million acres, basically 94.4 million acres. We had last year about final numbers about 98.8 million. So, that's down over 4 million, heading towards 4.5 million acres lower. The USDA had come out earlier in their outlook forum that held in late February and projected 94 even for numbers. So USDA number actually a little bit lower than the pre-report estimates. It's interesting because it's such an important number for this year's supply demand balance sheets that the lowest pre-report trade estimates by the major firms that they survey is actually down to 92.6 million. So that's about 1.7 lower than even the average trade estimate. So a lot of potential. If you get something near that, then you've considerably tightened up crop prospects for 2026 for U.S. corn. Balance sheet would reflect that, and tighter ending stocks. Prices would move to the higher side. So we'll see. Highest estimate at 96, actually. So a lot of different opinions out there. We have that type of a range. Again, 92.6 on the low side, 96 million acres on the high side, an average of 94.4. So just a lot of variation. And if we do see that type of movement, I wonder what part of the countries we'll see it in. Is that probably in parts of the U.S. Central Corn Belt, where we can plant more soybeans, perhaps? If we're not planting corn on those high quality acres, we're planting beans largely, and some other crops too. And then conversely, for soybeans, whereas last year we'd planted 81.2 million acres of soybeans, the average trade estimate going into that report Tuesday morning is for about 85.5 million acres. So up over 4.2. So about what we've taken away from corn in terms of expectations, we've added to soybeans. And it's interesting to watch how I think largely we're looking at a cost of production driven issue more so. All the futures, corn, soybeans, and even hard red winter wheat, after having jumped up fairly high within the last week have kind of moderated, somewhat lower and sideways. Of course, at the end of this session today, we'll talk about other factors that are coming in, and you've got again the Middle East war with energy prices all roiled up and all that carrying over onto the any market that's tied into bioenergy. And of course, that's corn and soybeans front and center. So interesting to watch. There is some changes also in terms of different types of wheat classes, although here in Kansas, I wouldn't say we're baked in with hard red winter wheat numbers as we have them right now, because things can sure shift around. We have some worries about crop survival from some low temperatures in parts of the state, all that coming into play. It seems too early to start pulling the plug on wheat in some of these damaged areas in terms of our expectations. We'd be waiting for verification on that, probably in the acreage report coming out at the end of June. Other important crops here in Kansas for sorghum. Average trade estimate 6.5 million acres. We had last year 6.6, so down a little bit, but a range of from 6.2 to 6.8. So still a lot of uncertainty as to where all this might go. Cotton acres projected to be just down slightly in the U.S. from where we were last year. Oats, rice, other crops that aren't that big in the U.S. Barley is pretty important to us, mainly because other countries that aren't buying sorghum, well, they've substituted barley in the past, and China had done that in the last year. So we're watching all these crops. So there's that part of it. There's also the quarterly stocks report. Average trade estimates basically are for projected March 1st quarterly stocks for U.S. corn, 9.1 billion bushels, and that would be the highest March 1st stocks number back since 1927. So part of that's just upward trend, but it's a response actually to that 17 plus billion bushel corn crop that was raised last year. So what happens if we don't get that high number? Then you would start to raise questions about, well, was that crop last year really that big? Because we have a pretty good idea what the usage is for most of these. The only category that we really are kind of, I'm not saying guessing on, but we can't really measure by other government stats would be feed usage. So either you got a feed usage issue going on, or you've got a 2025 crop issue going on. If you have a sizable miss on the expectations going into the March 1st number. For soybeans, projected at average trade estimate for March 1st, just a little over 2 billion bushels. We had on March 1st last year 1.9 billion. So arguably we're about basically pretty close. We're pretty close, not that much higher in terms of the actual amounts we had last year, just moving up to some degree on it. So big report Tuesday, the chance for a lot of market volatility, especially if the acreage numbers vary widely. If we get enough surprise that we get to the higher or lower end of those pre-report trade estimate ranges, then the market, as it's skittish about so many things right now, would look at that, and the grain markets, pardon me, and that would probably bring about some real volatility. I would say just quickly that again, if we do move to the higher or lower side, corn closed yesterday, Thursday, March 26th, at 467. We have traded down as low as about 457, 458 within the last week, within the last 2 weeks at 450. So if we get higher corn acreage than had been thought, start moving lower, we'd start to look at 450 and 458 and 460 as areas that the market might pause at. Interesting to watch that. And I would say the technical indicators for corn in the last basically for the last month have all been pretty positive. The RSI relative strength indices all above 50%, hanging out a lot closer to 75 than otherwise. So again, Middle East oil issues, announcement that the government is moving towards E15 year round, all in play for helping to maintain corn demand and make the outlook a little more rosy for the corn markets. For soybeans, we had jumped all the way up to about 1235, 1240 within the last week or so. Traded down to 1173 and 3/4 yesterday on Thursday the 26th. If we would get a negative surprise in the market, we've traded down to 1150, not too recently. We're not very far from that, really. But if we start to really move lower with a negative surprise in the corn market, we really don't see a lot to stop movement until you get all the way down to, towards $11. And actually, the low in the last 2 months is about 1050. So got a lot going on. And wheat prices also. Wheat prices have been jumping up of late. Had been as high at one day up to about 650. Closed yesterday at 626 and 3/4. Had gotten down recently in the last several days. This would be the May contract down to about 590 or so. So there's room to reverberate in those markets. And last thing I would say is that so we're looking at things that we mainly pay attention to in the ag markets in terms of USDA-based supply numbers, demand numbers, and usage. Just so much right now, dependent on the worries or confidences of the overall markets, overall financial markets, following from the energy markets, is Straits of Hormuz and all these other issues at play, and those issues are feeding over into the ag markets, the commodities, especially for corn and soybeans, where we now have a sizable bioenergy, ethanol, biodiesel components to that demand structure. So I guess period of time that we'd normally think things be fairly docile heading into March and April. Now we've got this whole raft of outside influences that are bringing volatility and both opportunities and threat to the grain markets.
Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much, Shelby. We appreciate it.
That was K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing brown wheat mites with K-State Extension entomologist Anthony Zukoff. Anthony, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Anthony, why are brown wheat mites something that wheat growers should maybe be checking out their fields for?
Well, right now, in particular, it started off a few weeks ago, Western Kansas. We have had several instances and quite widespread activity of brown wheat mite in fields out here in Western Kansas along the Colorado border. People have been treating for brown wheat mite. And this is a year where they're particularly notable and causing problems because brown wheat mite likes this droughty weather. They like it dry and they like it cool. So they're an early season wheat and triticale pest, and they benefit when it's dry. And the fact that we've had this dry weather kind of creeping all through the west and into central and even a little bit of eastern Kansas, this year the brown wheat mite is pretty widespread. And folks need to be getting out into their field and taking a look because their damage can mimic drought stress. And so we shouldn't just dismiss an unhappy wheat field as being just impacted by drought.
And if people are going out to see, is it drought, is it brown wheat mite, would they be able to see this pest to be able to see that, oh, this isn't just drought?
Yes. Luckily, you don't need a hand lens to see the mite itself. If you want to see the details of its body really well, sure, a hand lens is definitely going to help. But when you go out into a field that's infested, you will see active mites. Brown wheat mites are active during the day when it's sunny. They like it when it's warm and sunny. They're active. So if you're scouting, don't go early in the morning. Don't go in the evening when it's getting cold. They're going to be down at the ground level underneath the soil, taking shelter. So get out there in the middle of the day when it's warmest. And if they're present, you'll see them walking and crawling all over the wheat leaves. They're not shy. They'll come out on top of the wheat. So you'll be able to see little brown specks moving around. They are pretty skittish and they'll drop from the leaves. But when you walk into that field that looks stressed and you're starting to see those little brown mites moving around, that's indication you want to look a little closer, see how widespread it is in the field. And if they're really active, you'll start seeing along the leaves themselves, there'll be yellow stippling from the mite feeding. So little yellow spots up and down the leaves. And the tips of the leaves will likely, under enough pressure, usually be dead. And they die from the tip back because the mites like to start feeding at the tips of the leaves. So you take on this kind of scorched appearance.
If someone sees brown wheat mites in their field, then does that automatically mean they should go ahead and treat for it? Or is there a threshold?
There is a threshold. It's kind of weakly defined. Generally speaking, several hundred mites per linear foot In some states, neighboring states, and in other areas will use number of mites per leaf. But like I said, they're very quick moving. They're skittish. They'll drop from leaves. It makes them really hard to get a accurate count. So that kind of several hundred per linear foot, that's basically you walk out into the field and they're really easy to see, and the field's looking stressed and you can see mite damage. I would say you probably need to consider making a treatment, especially if we're about right now. We're kind of early in their cycle. They will naturally peak around mid-April, maybe towards the end of April, and start to naturally decline and then eventually go dormant by, early May. So if we're getting closer to that end of April, that's when you want to maybe second guess making a treatment option, depending on what's going on with the weather. A good hard rain can take care of them. But this early in their cycle, if you're seeing notable stress and damage from the mites and you're seeing mites, you probably want to make a treatment decision.
You mentioned that rain can just take care of them. Is that because they just flood them away?
Yeah, a good driving rain. These are really delicate pests. They're tiny little mites, and a good rain will literally just kind of drown them, beat them into the mud, and really take out significant infestations, knock them back really well. So if that's in the forecast, you might want to wait for that to come by and then reevaluate a field after a good rain to see if you're still seeing them. Even after making a treatment decision, that field is the recovery of the field impacted by these mites is gonna rely on, getting happy again. So it's gonna rely on getting moisture, getting rain to really fully recover. And so if you are getting a good rain, maybe you're knocking that population back, you go out and reevaluate and see if that wheat's getting happy again. And if there's any residual amount of mites around, that happier wheat stand could probably take a little bit of brown wheat mite pressure, especially if you're getting closer to the end of the natural cycle, you might be able to coast on.
And you wrote an e-update article on this, and within there, you mentioned that the last major outbreak was in 2022. And so where have they been the past few years?
Well, these mites are kind of just all over the landscape. They're going to be persisting to some degree in very low numbers. Even in wheat fields during off seasons when we don't have outbreaks, they're going to be around in low numbers. Another thing to consider is volunteer wheat that's allowed just to sit around all summer. That's going to harbor these mites. It's going to kind of create a bridge from spring to fall and keep that mite in the landscape. So then when we have a year or a couple years like we have of this dry weather, that population slowly builds up and then becomes a problem like we have now.
So a crop rotation won't really help them if we're not able to kill everything around those fields?
Right. Crop rotation isn't a guarantee. It helps because these mites do prefer continuous production scenarios. But out here in Western Kansas this year, we're having a kind of an equal mixture of continuous production being impacted and also rotated fields are having to be treated as well. So it really just depends on the year. So rotation does help. It's not a guarantee on years like this.
What do their eggs look like? And are there differences between what seasons they might be hatching if people are out scouting in their fields right now?
Yes, that's a good question. And it's a very important point, actually. It sounds crazy to scout for mite eggs, but this is an important consideration when it comes to brown wheat mite, and it is doable. You do need a hand lens. But when you go out into a field with brown wheat mite, I encourage folks to stop and pick up a clod of dirt or maybe some old corn stubble, what have you, that's sitting on the ground, and look on the bottom of that where it was touching the ground. And you're going to look for a couple things. So there's two different forms of the eggs. There's going to be a bronze reddish egg, and they're very small, kind of circular and flattened. And so this is where a little hand lens comes into play. And those bronze reddish eggs are going to be hatching in season, so right now. All right, so those are going to be hatching, in a day or two or whatever, depending on the temperature. There's another form that are white eggs. Similar shape, they're round, flattened, but they're bright white. If you see those white eggs, those are not going to be hatching until the fall. And so getting out there to see what the ratio is, once you're out there and you start seeing white eggs more abundant than those bronze reddish eggs, that population of mite is naturally declining. So those females that are laying eggs are now laying eggs that are going to be dormant all summer and not hatching until the fall. And so your risk of further damage is dramatically decreasing. And so when you start seeing a lot of white eggs, usually treatment decisions are not justified at that point.
Are the white eggs just the beginning stages that will eventually develop into the brown reddish eggs?
Right. So these white eggs, what they'll do is when we get to fall later this year, they will hatch and they'll have females emerge. all these brown wheat mites are females. They don't need to reproduce sexually, so they'll start laying eggs and they'll have a couple generations in the fall, 1 or 2 generations, and then they'll just kind of sit and stay dormant. And then once spring kicks in, that's when they're the big concern, and they start reproducing very quickly, laying a lot of those red eggs again, and then leads to these outbreaks that we have now. So those white eggs, again, will sit through summer. They'll hatch in the fall in those same areas, and you'll have active female mites. They're not going to be a concern for damage in the fall, but they will be reproducing a little bit, getting ready for spring.
What are some control options for people who do need to control their brown wheat mites?
So our chemical applications are pretty limited for this pest. So there are 2 good chemical options that'll provide control of this mite. One is dimethoate, and the other is chlorpyrifos, which you folks probably know as Lorsban. So those 2 products will take care of these mites really well if you're at threshold and you need to treat. But keep in mind that these products will kill all the beneficials in anything else in that wheat field. So I encourage folks to make sure that if you need to spray, that's when you want to use these products. If you're not at threshold, kind of hold off and reevaluate in a week or so, just to try to preserve beneficials as much as possible.
As we talked with Logan Simon recently, he mentioned brown wheat mites as we were discussing the status of wheat in Western Kansas. And as that was focused towards Western Kansas, are we seeing brown wheat mites move eastward?
As of this week, I have had calls from the Salina area, that far east of fields that were getting treated. So this is usually isolated to the western part of the state. This year, I think the drought conditions have crept so far east, and we're kind of staying in that dry pattern. It's allowed these mites, which, like I said, they're present and to some degree all over, in areas of the central part of the state creeping towards the eastern third. Dry areas are having issues. So I wouldn't dismiss if you're out east. If you see a field that looks drought stressed, get out there and just double check, make sure you're not having mite pressure.
Anthony, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much.
That was K-State Extension entomologist Anthony Zukoff. If you'd like to read more about brown wheat mites, you can do so by checking out a recent Agronomy e-update article in the March 12th issue titled Brown Wheat Mite Active in Western Kansas. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can find it for yourself by going to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. If you are wanting to check out other insects that you could be finding in Kansas, you can find the Crop Insects in Kansas book by going to the bookstore, which is bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu, or once again, I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're now cutting to a short break, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with the weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, these past few days, in my opinion, have really felt like summer. However, we're still in spring, so are we going to see a change?
We've had impressive temperatures over the course of the last week. You know, we had temperatures we had 99 in 3 different places in the state, and making another run at it as we record this. So really impressive heat. We go back to basically 1907, where a lot of the records were set for this time of the year, and 100 degrees. I think it's 101 actually in Plainville is the go-for record for the warmest temperature in March ever recorded in Kansas. And, you know, it's not often we talk about record highs of that nature these days. You know, a lot of times we're talking about record lows getting broken. We're basically on the eastern edge of a really prominent high-pressure system across the southwestern U.S., and we're not getting the full blast of the heat. That's occurring mainly to our west, but we just get these little 2 or 3 day tastes of the impressive heat before we get another cold front. We've had fairly frequent cold fronts, about 1 every 2 to 3 days, and that's really been the theme this year so far, with this La Nina influence still persisting across the United States, with the jet stream kind of going up into the western Canada, then coming south down over the plains and eastward across the southeast U.S. And that's been just enough to bring in these frontal passages that scour out the moisture and push it, the Gulf moisture, and push it back into the Gulf, and don't allow any of that moisture to come northward. And that's really what we rely on for getting precipitation this time of year. We have to get these big pushes of Gulf ocean moisture that pushes north and east into the central plains. And with these frequent fronts, we're just not able to make that happen.
Are we going to see some moisture as we look ahead?
Yeah, so the pattern's going to break down a little bit. That high pressure is going to weaken as we go through the weekend. And then we start to see it get replaced by a trough of low pressure as the pattern becomes a little bit more active and shifting southerly. And it looks like the focus of that will be several systems. The first, a more potent cold front potentially early next week that tries to cut off the Gulf, but then the trough of low pressure sucks up that Gulf moisture and overrides that cold. It sets us up for a pretty big storm system later next week, around that Thursday, Friday timeframe, with some decent moisture return expected from the Gulf. And that's going to set up a pattern where we get these big low pressure system that's going to develop somewhere in the central plains and likely to track north and east across the plains. And those are our big weather makers. We see typically severe weather out ahead of a dry line, usually favoring eastern Kansas, especially this early in the season. And then we also see a fire weather threat to the western part of the state, where we get these strong winds and really dry southwest air that pushes northward into that low behind those storms. And that results in kind of a double-edged sword, where the storms are in the east and we don't get widespread rain and we get fired to the west. And that's kind of the pattern we were expecting this spring as this La Nina starts to break down. And hopefully, at least while most of the state probably is not going to get widespread rainfall with this system later next week, we're still dry all the way till then, but it'll at least wet the soils, the really parched, drought-stricken soils in Oklahoma and Texas and to our east. That'll set the stage for the next storm system like this to come through likely the following week, to maybe bring that Gulf moisture a little bit further west and maybe start a positive trend to bringing rainfall into the region.
You mentioned severe weather. Does that mean tornadoes?
Yeah, well, we can expect anything, any form of severe weather in the spring. But the only thing we can rule out is tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanoes. But yeah, we'll definitely open the door. We've already seen some pretty potent tornadoes across the southern plains this spring. Obviously, we've been in a lull since the last event here earlier in March, but this is the overall pattern of the transition in the East Pacific of La Nina towards more neutral, maybe even El Nino by early spring. That tends to increase our tornado potential and tornado outbreak potential across the plains. And so as we move forward, I think we're definitely going to see an increase in tornado activity as well as hail and wind.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's what we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.